In the high valleys of the Montana Territory, in the late summer of 1888, people started seeing something strange. They saw a boy, not yet a man, hauling salvaged timbers up a steep game trail. He wasn't building on the flat, cleared land like a sensible person. He was heading for a dark scar in the limestone bluff overlooking the creek, a cave mouth, gaping and black. The boy was 19-year-old Thomas Kane, and the locals thought he'd lost his mind, or worse, that he'd gone feral. He and his younger sister, Alara, had been cast out by their uncle a few months prior. Now, instead of building a proper cabin, he was dragging the bones of a collapsed barn up to a hole in the ground. By September, the gossip at the dusty trading post had hardened into a grim consensus. The boy was building a tomb. And when the winter of 1888 hit with a fury that would be spoken of for 100 years, that crazy cave dwelling would prove the difference between survival and surrender. If you want to know the number, the exact temperature reading that made the territory's most experienced builders go silent, stay until the end. What did this outcast teenager understand about heat, stone, and survival that every seasoned frontiersman in the valley had missed? If you enjoy stories of quiet competence and vindication, consider subscribing and drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Thomas Kane wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 19-year-old orphan trying to keep his 15-year-old sister alive. Their parents had been taken by influenza the previous winter. Their uncle, a hard man with a small farm and a smaller capacity for charity, had taken them in. But Thomas had a stubborn streak. He questioned his uncle's methods, his crop rotations, his refusal to brace a failing barn wall. The wall collapsed in a summer squall, just as Thomas predicted. The uncle, his pride wounded more than his assets, gave him an ultimatum. "You think you know so much," he'd said, his voice flat with anger. "Go know it somewhere else." He gave them a worn tent, 2 blankets, and a week's worth of food. He told them not to come back. So Thomas and Alara were on their own. They had no money for a proper claim, no funds for milled lumber or glass windows. All they had was Thomas's back, his hands, and a peculiar piece of knowledge he hadn't even known was valuable. Before his parents' passing, he'd spent a 6-month stint working with a railroad crew. He wasn't laying track. He was a powder monkey's assistant, helping blast tunnels through the granite shoulders of the mountains. He'd spent his days in the dark, feeling the deep, unwavering coolness of the earth. He learned about drainage, about how rock sweats, and about how 100 feet of stone overhead laughs at the wind. That thought nagged at him as he and Alara faced their first few weeks in the tent. The late summer nights were already growing cold. He watched the wind whip across the valley floor, shaking the canvas of their flimsy shelter. He saw other settlers building their cabins, sturdy log boxes, chinked with mud and moss, set right out in the open. By frontier standards, they were more than respectable. But Thomas saw something else. He saw structures that had to fight the wind every second of every day. He saw walls that would be directly assaulted by the killing cold. Wind doesn't just chill the air. It strips heat directly from walls through a process called convection. A 30-mile-per-hour wind can make a 0-degree day feel like 30 below. To a log wall, it feels even colder. It's a constant, relentless thief of warmth. One evening, shivering beside a small fire, Thomas looked up at the bluff. He saw the cave. It was south-facing, which meant it would catch the low winter sun. It was deep, and it was made of stone. The railroad crew had taught him that a few feet underground, the temperature barely changes all year. Whether it was 100 degrees in summer or 40 below in winter, the deep earth held steady around 50 degrees. A cave was a natural extension of that deep, stable earth. His plan formed. It was simple, and to everyone else, it was insane. He wasn't going to fight the winter. He was going to hide from it. He would use the mountain itself as his primary wall. He would build his house inside the earth's embrace. He found a small, unclaimed parcel of land with the cave on it, filed the papers, and began the work that would make him a local legend and a local laughingstock. The materials had to be cheap. That meant they had to be free. Thomas spent 2 weeks painstakingly disassembling a barn that had collapsed in a meadow 5 miles away. The farmer who owned the land told him he could have the wood if he cleared it. So Thomas and Alara worked from dawn to dusk, prying apart timbers, straightening bent nails, and stacking weathered planks. The wood was old, dry, and hard as iron. He carried it, piece by piece, on his back up the trail to the cave. His next trip was to the site of a recently built homestead. The owner had discarded 2 small, cracked window panes. Thomas offered to chop a week's worth of firewood for them. He walked away with the windows, carefully wrapped in his spare shirt. For a stove, he found a rusted-out barrel and, with a borrowed set of metal snips, fashioned a simple but functional wood stove, sealing the seams with a mixture of ash and clay. The construction began not with building up, but with digging down. He didn't just sweep the cave floor, he excavated it. Using a pick and shovel, he leveled a 20 by 15-foot area about 30 feet back from the cave mouth. This was critical. He needed to be deep enough inside to be protected from the wind, but not so deep that ventilation became a problem. As he dug, he explained the first principle to Alara, who was hauling out buckets of dirt and rock. "The ground here," he said, tapping the cave wall, "is about 50-55 degrees all year. We're not building a house that has to stay warm when it's 40 below outside. We're building a house that has to stay warm when it's 50 degrees outside. It's a different problem." He dug a narrow trench around the perimeter of the floor, leading out toward the cave mouth. This was for drainage. His railroad experience had taught him that water is the enemy of any underground structure. Rock walls, especially limestone, can weep moisture. The drainage trench would ensure any condensation or seepage would be channeled away from their living space, keeping the floor bone dry. He filled the trench with a foot of coarse gravel he and Alara hauled up from the creek bed. Then he started framing. He built a simple, rectangular structure inside the leveled area of the cave, a cabin within a cave. This was the part that made no sense to passers-by, who occasionally rode out to gawk. Why build a whole separate structure inside a perfectly good shelter? Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. Thomas left a 2-foot gap between his wooden walls and the rock walls of the cave. This wasn't wasted space. It was the most important part of the design. This air gap would act as a thermal break and a moisture barrier. Still air is a fantastic insulator. That 2-foot buffer of trapped, unmoving air was like the space between 2 panes of glass in a modern window. It would insulate his living space from the direct, damp chill of the rock. He framed the walls and a low, angled roof, covering them with the thickest planks from the old barn. He meticulously filled every single crack and seam, first with dried moss, then with a thick daubing of clay mixed with grass. He was creating a sealed, insulated box. The front wall, the only one exposed to the outside air near the cave mouth, he made twice as thick. He set his two small, salvaged windows into this front wall. For the stove, he used old piping to run the chimney flue up, over, and out of the cave mouth, extending it 10 feet into the open air. This prevented smoke from filling the cave and ensured a proper draft. It was a detail most people would miss, but it was essential for safety and efficiency. From the outside, the finished result was bizarre. It looked like a small, rough cabin had been shoved partway into a hole in the mountain. The front was weathered wood and glass. The back simply disappeared into the darkness. It was a strange hybrid, half man, half mountain, total cost, in cash, under $5. The filing fee for the land claim. Everything else was bartered for, salvaged, or harvested. Elara, who had worked tirelessly beside him, looked at the finished structure with a mix of pride and deep anxiety. "Thomas," she said one evening, her voice barely a whisper, "people are going to think we're animals living in a cave." Thomas looked from her worried face to the solid wooden wall of their home, then to the massive stone arch of the cave surrounding it. He could feel the steady, calm coolness of the earth. He heard no wind. "Let them," he said, and when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw desperation. They saw a final pitiful retreat from civilized life. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with a visit from Jedediah Thorne. Thorne ran the sawmill and had built nearly half the respectable homes in the valley, including the new church. He was a man whose professional identity was tied to straight lines, pitched roofs, and solid foundations set on open ground. He rode up to the cave one afternoon in October, ostensibly to check on the orphans. He dismounted, his eyes scanning the strange construction with a practiced, critical gaze. Thomas came out to meet him. "Son," Thorne said, not unkindly, "I respect the work you've put in here, but this won't do." He gestured at the rock wall just beyond the wooden structure. "That limestone is going to sweat all winter. The moment your stove heats the air in here, moisture will condense on that cold rock. Everything you own will be damp. You'll get mold, lung sickness. You've built a root cellar, not a home. It'll be a wet, miserable tomb by January." It was a technical, specific objection, and it sounded reasonable. It was based on 70 years of frontier building experience. Thomas just nodded. "I put in a drainage trench, Mr. Thorne." "A trench won't stop the air itself from being wet," Thorne countered, shaking his head with a sigh of pity. "You're fighting the mountain. It's a fight you can't win." Thomas kept his voice level, just trying something different. Thorne left, convinced he'd just met a boy too stubborn to be saved. The story of his visit spread. The technical objection gave the gossip a veneer of authority. The cruelest insult came a week later. Thomas was at the trading post, buying a small sack of flour and some salt, a rare expenditure. Silas, a big, bearded trapper who prided himself on his toughness, was holding court by the stove. He saw Thomas and raised his voice for everyone to hear. "Heard young Thomas is livin' like a badger now," Silas boomed, a grin splitting his beard. "Diggin' holes in the dirt, Guess that's fittin' for someone run out of a proper home." A few men chuckled nervously. The store owner busied himself behind the counter. Thomas paid for his flour, met Silas's mocking gaze for a brief second, and walked out without a word. The nickname stuck. To some, he was now Badger Boy. The gossip found its way to Ilara. At a church social she'd attended, hoping for a bit of company, the women spoke in whispers when she approached. One, the blacksmith's wife, asked with saccharine concern if they were managing all right in that place. The pity in her eyes was worse than any insult. Ilara stopped going to socials. The institutional skeptic arrived in the form of Reverend Miller, a traveling preacher who made rounds through the territory. He was a good man, genuinely concerned for the spiritual and physical welfare of his scattered flock. He rode up to the cave in early November, his Bible in his saddlebag. "Son," he said, his face etched with concern, "I've heard about your living situation. This isn't in any manual I've seen on frontier settlement. It's not proper. It's not civilized. The Lord provides timber for homes, ground for foundations. A cave is for beasts of the field." "The Lord also provides stone, Reverend," Thomas replied quietly, "and a shield from the wind." The final cut, the one that went deepest, came not from a stranger, but from a memory. Thomas found himself constantly replaying his uncle's parting words. "You're too stubborn for your own good. People are going to think you're either scared or incompetent. Maybe both. You'll come crawling back before the first snow." Every time a horseman paused on the trail below to stare up at the cave, Thomas heard his uncle's voice. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was building an argument against that final, damning judgment. He said to Ilara one night, as the first flakes of snow began to fall, "I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm trying to keep us warm." By mid-November, not one person in the valley thought Thomas Kane had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own stubborn foolishness, a crude shelter that would become a damp, frozen crypt once the real cold arrived. They were wrong. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Thomas right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1888 to 89 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as one of the most severe in the 20th century. It wasn't just a storm, it was a siege. A mass of Arctic air, what meteorologists today would call a polar vortex, descended from Canada and settled over the northern plains. And it did not move. The temperature escalation was relentless. December 8th, the thermometer at the trading post read -18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. People grumbled and threw another log on the fire. December 12th, it hit -31. Livestock started to sicken. By December 18th, it was -38, with a wind that howled down from the north at 40 miles per hour. The wind chill was below -60. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never climbed above zero. The snow fell, dry and granular like sand. It didn't drift so much as it scoured the landscape, driven by a wind so sharp it felt like breathing powdered glass. The community, which had been so confident in its conventional wisdom, began to break down. The suffering was specific and widespread. Jedediah Thorne, the master builder, was burning through 2 cords of prime, seasoned oak per month in his own well-built home. And still his wife complained that the interior temperature barely held 42 degrees. Frost coated the nails on their interior walls. The Miller family, who lived downriver, found their chimney choked with creosote and ice. With the stove unable to draw properly, their cabin filled with smoke. They spent a week huddled in a single room, shivering under every blanket they owned, their children coughing from the cold and the haze. Silas, the trapper, lost half his horses. They froze to death in a barn he thought was sturdy. He was burning green wood he'd cut in the fall, and the moisture in it was stealing most of the heat. A log of wet wood at 50% moisture content requires thousands of BTUs of energy just to boil off the water before it can produce any useful heat. His stove hissed and sputtered, producing more steam than warmth, while his cabin stayed just above freezing. People started burning furniture, fence posts, anything that would catch fire. And then people started noticing the Kane place. There was no frantic activity, no desperate chopping of wood, just a thin, steady, almost lazy plume of smoke rising from the pipe that jutted out of the rock face. One afternoon, Jedediah Thorne was riding a circuit to check on his neighbors, his face wrapped in wool until only his eyes were visible. As he passed below the bluff, he saw a figure emerge from the cave mouth. It was Thomas. He wasn't wearing a heavy coat. He was in his shirt sleeves. He walked to the woodpile, calmly split a few logs, stacked them, and went back inside. Thorne stopped his horse. It was 42 degrees below zero. The wind was a physical force, and the boy was working in his shirt sleeves. It didn't make sense. It was impossible. Stay with me, because the number that came out of that cave didn't just surprise the valley. It defied the laws of winter as they knew them. On January 10th, the cold reached its brutal peak. A weather station at a nearby Army fort officially recorded a temperature of minus 61 degrees Fahrenheit. In the valley, with the wind factored in, some claimed it felt closer to minus 80. It was a cold that killed. It was on this day that Jedediah Thorne's conscience finally got the better of him. He was a proud man, but not a cruel one. He couldn't shake the image of the boy in his shirt sleeves, but he also couldn't shake the memory of his own dire prediction. If he was right about the dampness, the cold would have turned that cave into an icebox. He pictured the two orphans, frozen. He loaded his sleigh with a quarter cord of his best seasoned birch, wood that was like gold in this cold, and made the slow journey to the bluff. He told himself it was an emergency delivery. He expected to find them desperate or worse. He trudged through the deep snow up to the cave mouth and knocked on the heavy wooden door. It swung open a moment later. Ilara stood there. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It wasn't a blast of dry, scorching heat from an overstoked stove. It was a steady, silent, enveloping warmth. It hit him like stepping from January into September. He stood there, a giant of a man bundled in bearskin and wool, speechless. Ilara looked up at him. "Mr. Thorne, is everything all right?" Behind her, through the cabin opening, Thorne saw the scene that would forever alter his understanding of his craft. He saw Thomas at a small table, meticulously cleaning a rifle. The boy looked up and nodded a greeting, and on a small rug near the gently humming stove, he saw the detail that crystallized the vindication. The girls at the Miller place were wearing 3 layers of wool and were still shivering. Ilara was wearing a simple cotton dress, not coats, not blankets, a dress, Thorn finally found his voice, stammering. Your, your wood. I brought you some wood. I was worried you'd be running low. That's kind of you, Thomas said, standing up. But we're managing fine. You can leave it by the pile if you like. Thorn stepped inside, unable to process the sensory shock. The air was warm, and it was dry. He sniffed. There was no smell of damp or mold. It smelled of wood smoke, bread, and clean linen. How much are you burning?" he asked. "About a small armload every 4 or 5 hours," Thomas said. "Less at night. We're using less than a cord every 2 weeks." Thorn stared at him. "A cord every 2 weeks?" he repeated, his voice hollow. "People are burning half a cord a week just to keep from freezing to death. Silas is burning more than that." His eyes scanned the small, warm room and landed on a thermometer hanging on an interior wall. It was a cheap one from the trading post, but it would be accurate enough. He walked over to it, his heavy boots loud on the wooden floor. The mercury sat clearly and steadily at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees. Thorn turned and looked back out the open door, at the gray, brutalized landscape shivering under a pale sun. Outside, the actual air temperature was at least 60 below zero, a difference of nearly 130 degrees. He reached out and touched the wooden wall. It was warm. He then stepped into the 2-foot gap between the inner structure and the cave wall. He touched the raw limestone. It was cool, but not frozen, and it was bone dry. Thomas's design wasn't fighting the mountain, it was cooperating with it. The insulated inner box kept their heat in, while the massive thermal battery of the surrounding rock, holding its steady 50-degree temperature, acted as a huge buffer against the impossible cold outside. The wind, the primary enemy of every other house in the valley, couldn't touch this place. Thorn pulled out his own pocket thermometer, a more reliable one. He held it up in the middle of the room. After 5 minutes, it read 67 degrees. The numbers were real. This wasn't a fluke. It was engineering. The comparison was staggering. The Colby Ranch, 2 cords of wood per month to hold 42 degrees. The Williams cabin, 1.8 cords per month to hold 48 degrees. Thomas Kane's cave house, less than a cord per month to hold 67 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. Thorn walked back to the center of the room, looking from the simple barrel stove to the calm faces of the 2 teenagers. He, the master builder, lived in a 40-degree box that devoured fuel. This boy, the outcast, lived in a 70-degree haven that sipped it. He finally looked at Thomas, the boy he had pitied and dismissed. "I've been building houses in this valley for 30 years, Jedediah Thorn said, his voice quiet, with the weight of a fundamental truth revealed. "We've been doing it wrong." This wasn't just about warmth, it was about dignity. In this small, warm space, Laura did schoolwork without shivering. Thomas could read in the evenings. They slept through the night, under a single blanket, not piled with every piece of fabric they owned. The system turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. Thomas, seeing the look on Thorn's face, walked to a small crate and pulled out a ledger. He had kept meticulous records, dates, morning and evening temperatures inside and out, wind conditions, and a precise tally of the wood consumed each day. This wasn't luck. It was data. He handed the ledger to Thorn, who read it in silence. It was the irrefutable proof of a principle that had been waiting in the earth all along. Word of Thorn's visit spread faster than a prairie fire. The story was too dramatic to be contained. The image of Thorn, the valley's most respected builder, standing in stunned silence inside the badger's den, became an instant local legend. The impossible number, 68 degrees in the face of a minus 60-degree blizzard, was repeated with a sense of awe. By the time the great cold snap broke in late January, half the valley knew something impossible was happening on the Kane claim. The mockery died overnight, replaced by a grudging, then open respect. The first convert was the Miller family, the same family whose chimney had failed, forcing them to endure a week of smoke and shivering. Their youngest son had developed a deep, rattling cough, and Mr. Miller was desperate. His cabin was leaking heat from a dozen places, and he was nearly out of firewood. One morning he swallowed his pride and rode up to Thomas's cave. He didn't ask for a handout. He asked for knowledge. "How?" he asked simply. "Just show me how." Thomas didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He walked with Miller to a low south-facing hill on his property and explained the principle of using the earth itself as insulation. They planned a simpler variation, not a cave house, but a dugout. They would dig into the hillside, shore up the walls with thick timbers, and build only the front-facing wall and roof, deeply banked with sod. It was less complex than Thomas's design, but it was based on the same logic. For the next 2 weeks, Thomas spent his afternoons helping Miller dig and build. By spring, the Miller family had a new, semi-subterranean home. The following winter, they would use less than a third of the wood they had previously, and their children would sleep in warm beds. The idea, now proven, began to spread. That summer, 7 other families in the valley built some form of earth-sheltered home. 12 more followed the next year. They weren't all cave houses. Some were sod-roofed dugouts. Others were cabins built against heavily bermed hillsides. But all of them embraced the core concept Thomas had demonstrated. Stop fighting the cold and wind head on. Use the mass of the earth as your ally. Reverend Miller, the institutional skeptic, became the official documenter. He wrote a long, detailed letter to a territorial newspaper describing what he had witnessed. He included the temperature readings he himself had verified. He called Thomas Kane's dwelling a revelation in frontier architecture, praising the boy's ingenuity and quiet resilience. He no longer saw it as uncivilized. He saw it as profoundly wise. The principles Thomas Kane used in 1888 were not new, of course. For thousands of years, humans had used caves and earth lodges for shelter. What Thomas did was blend that ancient wisdom with sound frontier engineering. A sealed interior, proper ventilation, and moisture management. He built a structure that anticipated by nearly a century what modern building scientists would rediscover and call passive solar and earth-sheltered design. Years later, when asked about it, Thomas, now a respected man in the community, would just shrug. "It's not new," he'd say. "It's just correct. The earth holds the warmth better than the air does." He never patented anything, never charged for his advice. He just shared what he knew. The structure he built into the side of that cave stood for 80 years, a quiet monument to an idea. It served as a line shack and a hunter's shelter long after Thomas and Alara moved on to build a larger ranch. The frontier didn't ultimately reward stubbornness or tradition for tradition's sake. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded the quiet observation of a 19-year-old boy who understood that the greatest source of shelter wasn't the timber you could cut, but the earth you were standing on. He listened to the lessons of the mountain, and it gave him its strength in return. Drop a comment below. What's the coldest winter you've ever faced? And be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten wisdom and proven frontier techniques. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of survival techniques. The characters, names, and specific events are fictional, created for narrative purposes. However, the engineering principles of earth-sheltered construction, thermal mass, and passive heat management are based on real historical practices and established building science.